That cold morning, the millionaire was only thinking about money and deals. But when he saw a barefoot girl shivering from the cold, something shifted inside him. When he realized he had a hand in her situation, his world fell apart. Did this heartfelt story touch you? Then subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The asphalt of Madison Avenue glistened under the fine drizzle that began to fall on that June morning. New York winter arrived without warning, bringing with it the cutting cold that made the glass buildings seem even more imposing against the gray sky. Richard Taylor adjusted the heater in his black BMW as he navigated through the morning traffic, his thoughts already focused on the meeting that would define the biggest deal of his career. At 42, he had built a financial empire that few could achieve, and every minute of his day was calculated with surgical precision. His company, Taylor Investments, occupied 3 floors of one of the most expensive buildings in the city, and Richard was proud of every achievement that had brought him there. Coming from a simple family from upstate New York, he knew the value of hard work and determination. He never married, never had children, always believed that relationships were distractions that could compromise his focus on business. His routine was impeccable. He woke up at 5 in the morning, exercised in the home office of his Murray Hill apartment, checked international markets while having coffee, and arrived at the office before 7:30. That day, however, something unusual caught his attention. He was stopped at a light on Fifth Avenue when he saw a girl sitting at an abandoned bus stop hunched against the cold. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing a dirty white dress and a faded pink coat that seemed to offer no protection against the cold. Her bare feet were bluish, and she was shaking uncontrollably. Richard tried to ignore the scene, as he did with so many other street situations he encountered daily. After all, New York was full of people in vulnerable situations, and he couldn't solve all the city's problems. But something about that girl bothered him. Perhaps it was the way she was completely alone, or perhaps it was the fact that no adult seemed to be around to take care of her. The light turned green and he drove on, but the image of the child remained etched in his mind. 3 blocks ahead, Richard stopped the car. He couldn't focus on anything else: the presentation he would make in an hour, the graphs he had prepared, the numbers he had memorized the night before. Everything seemed to have lost importance. He made a U-turn, ignoring the honking of other drivers, and returned to the bus stop. The girl was still there, in the same position, as if she hadn't moved since he had first seen her. He parked the car and approached slowly. Up close, the situation was even more alarming. The child was clearly in a state of hypothermia. Her lips were purple, and she was breathing with difficulty. Her blonde hair was tangled and dirty, and when she raised her face to look at him, Richard saw 2 blue eyes without shine, as if all life had been sucked out of them. "Hi, little one," he said, crouching down in front of her. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond immediately. She observed him with a mixture of fear and distrust, as if she couldn't decide whether he represented a threat or a hope. Finally, in a voice so weak that he could barely hear her, she whispered, "I'm cold." Richard's heart tightened. Without thinking twice, he took off his wool coat and wrapped it around her. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm so as not to frighten her. "Isabella," she replied, and then added, "Isabella Sanders." "Isabella, where are your parents?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. "They went away," she said simply, as if it were the most natural explanation in the world. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had no experience with children, never knew how to deal with them, but at that moment he knew he needed to help. "I'm going to take you to a warm place, okay? You need medical care." Isabella nodded weakly, and Richard picked her up, startled by how light she was. It seemed like she hadn't eaten in days. He placed her in the back seat of the car, turned the heater to maximum, and covered her with the emergency blanket he kept in the trunk. During the drive to the hospital, he called his secretary to cancel all meetings for the day. "Mr. Taylor, the meeting with the Japanese investors cannot be postponed," Marcia protested on the other end of the line. "It's 3 years of negotiations. They flew in especially for—" "Reschedule for tomorrow," Richard interrupted. "An emergency came up." At Mount Sinai Hospital, the medical team attended to Isabella immediately. She was diagnosed with moderate hypothermia, and severe dehydration. While the doctors took care of her, Richard remained in the waiting room, restless. He couldn't understand why he felt so responsible for this child he had just met. He had always been a rational man who made decisions based on data and analysis, never on emotional impulses. The hospital social worker, Fiona Oliver, came to speak with him a few hours later. "You found the girl on the street?" she asked, sitting next to him. Yes, she was alone at a bus stop. She seemed to have spent the whole night there. Fiona made some notes on her clipboard. "We got some information. Isabella Sanders, 8 years old, orphaned since last month. Her parents died in a car accident on Interstate 87. She was living with an aunt, but the woman disappeared a week ago, leaving her alone." Richard felt his chest tighten. And now? Normally, she would be referred to a temporary shelter while we look for an adoptive family, but Fiona hesitated. "You saved her life. If you hadn't found her, she wouldn't have survived another night on the street. Would you like to be considered as a temporary guardian?" The question caught Richard by surprise. He had never considered the possibility of caring for a child. His life was structured, predictable, entirely focused on business. A child would change all that. But when he remembered Isabella's desperate look, he knew he couldn't simply hand her over to the system and go on with his life as if nothing had happened. "Yes," he answered, to his own surprise. "I accept," Fiona smiled. "It will be temporary while we process the paperwork for permanent adoption. But I need to warn you, taking care of a traumatized child is not easy. Isabella has been through a lot. She will need patience, love, and probably psychological counseling." Richard nodded, still not fully believing what he was doing. A few hours later, Isabella was discharged from the hospital. She was still weak, but the doctors said she would recover completely with proper care. Richard took her home, watching in the rearview mirror as she looked out the window with curiosity, watching the city go by. His apartment in Murray Hill was a perfect reflection of his personality. Modern, minimalist, not a single thing out of place. Everything was black, white or grey, with Italian designer furniture and abstract artwork on the walls. When Isabella entered, she seemed even smaller in that environment. Richard realized that his home had absolutely nothing that might interest a child. "Are you hungry?" he asked, realizing he had no idea what children like to eat. Isabella nodded timidly. Richard opened the refrigerator and realized that there was only salad, Greek yogurt, and some ready-made dishes from sophisticated restaurants. He ordered pizza, thinking that all children liked pizza. While they waited, he prepared the guest room for her, changing the black bedding for white ones he found in the closet. When the pizza arrived, Isabella ate only one slice, chewing slowly, as if she wasn't sure if she could trust that abundance. Richard observed her, trying to understand what was going through her mind. After dinner, he wasn't quite sure what to do. He had never had to put a child to bed. "Would you like to take a bath?" he suggested, and Isabella nodded. He took her to the bathroom, left clean towels, and waited outside. When she finished, she dressed in one of his shirts, which was huge on her, looking like a dress. "Good night, Isabella," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "If you need anything, my room is right next door." She nodded and lay down in bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Richard turned off the light and went to his room, but couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the turnaround his life had taken in just one day. In the morning, he was a successful businessman whose only concern was expanding his business. Now he had an orphaned child sleeping in the next room. Around 2 in the morning, he heard a low sound coming from Isabella's room. He got up and went to check, finding her crying silently, her face buried in the pillow. Richard stood at the door for a moment, not knowing what to do. Finally, he entered the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "It's okay," he said softly, gently touching her hair. "You're safe now." Isabella turned to him, her eyes shining with tears. "I miss my mom and dad," she whispered. Richard felt his heart break. "I know," he replied, because he didn't know what else to say. "I know you miss them." She moved closer to him, and Richard hugged her, feeling how fragile she was in his arms. They stayed like that for a long time, until her crying ceased and she fell asleep. Richard covered her carefully and returned to his room, but this time he slept deeply, with the feeling that he had done the right thing. The next morning, he woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving in the kitchen. He found Isabella trying to reach a cup in the high cabinet, balancing on a chair. "Good morning," she said, smiling timidly. "I wanted to make coffee for you." Richard smiled back, feeling a strange sensation of warmth in his chest. "Good morning." "Isabella, how about we have breakfast together?" As he prepared scrambled eggs and toast, he thought about how his life had changed overnight. He still didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he knew he wanted to take care of this girl. Isabella deserved a chance to be happy again, and he would do whatever it took to give her that chance. The first days with Isabella were a constant learning experience for Richard. He discovered that taking care of a child was much more complex than managing a multinational company. There were no spreadsheets that could predict when she would wake up crying from nightmares, nor reports that explained why she sometimes spent hours staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he couldn't reach. Richard hired a nanny, Mrs. Carmen, an experienced lady who lived in Jackson Heights and had raised 5 children. She arrived every morning at 7 and stayed until 6 in the evening, taking care of Isabella while he worked. But Richard found that he couldn't focus on business as before. During meetings, he caught himself thinking about whether Isabella had eaten properly or if she was feeling lonely. "Mr. Richard," Mrs. Carmen said one afternoon while preparing Isabella's snack, "the girl is very intelligent, but she needs school. She told me she knew how to read and write but hasn't been to school for over a month." Richard nodded, realizing there was another responsibility he hadn't considered. The next day, he personally went to St. Augustine Academy, a prestigious private school in the West Village. The principal, Helen, received him in her office. "Mr. Taylor, it's a pleasure to receive you," she said, offering him a chair. "I heard you would like to enroll a child." "Yes, it's a somewhat special situation," Richard explained. "Isabella she's under my temporary guardianship. She recently lost her parents and needs a welcoming environment to readapt." Principal Helen asked some questions about Isabella's situation and explained that the school had experience with children who had gone through trauma. "We have a school psychologist, Dr. Carla, who can help Isabella adapt. But it's important that you also continue psychological counseling outside of school." Richard agreed and scheduled an appointment with the child psychologist that the social worker had recommended, Dr. Beatrice Morgan. When he told Isabella about the school, she was silent for a moment before asking, "Will the other children like me?" "Of course they will," Richard replied, gently touching her face. "You're a very special girl." On the first day of school, Richard decided to take her personally. Isabella was wearing a new uniform and carrying a pink backpack that he had bought at the mall. She held his hand tightly as they walked through the school corridors. "Will you come back to pick me up?" she asked, her blue eyes full of concern. "I will," Richard promised, crouching down to be at her height. "At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I'll be here waiting for you." During the morning, Richard couldn't concentrate on anything. He called the school twice to find out how Isabella was adapting. Principal Helen reassured him, saying that she was shy but participating in the activities. When he went to pick her up in the late afternoon, he found Isabella playing on the playground with 2 other girls. She ran to him with a smile on her face, the first genuine smile he had seen since he found her. "Uncle Richard," she shouted, using the term they had agreed upon. "I made 2 friends, Julia and Marianne." Richard felt his heart warm. "That's great, Isabella. Did you have fun?" "Yes, Teacher Lucinda said I draw very well. Look." She showed a drawing she had made. A house with a garden, a man in a suit and a girl holding hands. "It's beautiful," said Richard, carefully storing the drawing. "We'll put it on the refrigerator when we get home." The following weeks established a routine. Richard woke up earlier to have breakfast with Isabella, took her to school, worked during the day, and picked her up in the late afternoon. Gradually, he adjusted his schedule to spend more time with her. He cancelled unnecessary trips and started working more from home. One night, while helping Isabella with her homework, she asked, "Uncle Richard, were you ever a child?" The question caught him by surprise. "Of course I was. Why are you asking?" "Because you're very serious. It seems like you were born an adult." Richard laughed, realizing she was right. "You're right, I forgot what it's like to be a child. How about you teach me?" Isabella smiled. "Can I teach you to play with dolls?" "You can," Richard replied, although he had no idea how to play with dolls. That's how Richard found himself, in the living room of his minimalist apartment, sitting on the floor playing house with Isabella. She had transformed the coffee table into a house for her dolls, using pillows as beds and cups as furniture. Richard felt ridiculous at first, but soon realized he was genuinely having fun. "Now the daddy doll has to go to work," Isabella said, moving a male doll toward a shoebox that represented an office. "And the daughter doll?" Richard asked. "She gets sad when daddy leaves, but she knows he'll come back," Isabella replied, her eyes suddenly filling with tears. Richard realized that the game had touched on something deep. "Isabella, you know I'll always come back to you, don't you?" She nodded, but Richard saw the uncertainty in her eyes. He pulled her into a hug. "I promise I'll never leave you alone." That night, after Isabella went to sleep, Richard stood on the apartment balcony, looking at the city lights. His life had changed completely. Before, he measured success by the numbers in his bank account and the growth of his company. Now success was Isabella's smile when he came home, or the way she ran to hug him when he picked her up from school. But not everything was easy. Isabella still had frequent nightmares, and there were nights when she woke up screaming, calling for her parents. Richard was learning to deal with these moments, always running to her room when he heard her cry. He would sit on the bed and hug her until she calmed down. "Did they go to heaven?" she asked on one of these nights. Richard wasn't religious, but he knew Isabella needed an explanation that would comfort her. "Yes, they did. And they're watching you from there, very proud to see how you're growing strong and brave." "Do you think they like you?" Isabella asked, nestling against him. Richard was silent for a moment. "I hope so. I hope they know I'm taking very good care of you." During the consultations with the psychologist, Dr. Beatrice explained that Isabella was making remarkable progress. "She's creating healthy bonds with you," said the doctor, "but it's important that you also process your own emotions. Becoming a father overnight is not easy." Richard had never thought of himself as a father. The concept still seemed strange to him, but gradually he began to understand that being a father had nothing to do with biology, but with love, dedication, and commitment. And he was discovering that he had much more capacity to love than he had imagined. On a Saturday afternoon, he decided to take Isabella to Central Park. She was delighted with the ducks in the lake and asked to feed them bread. Richard bought popcorn from a street vendor and watched as she laughed at the ducks' antics. "Uncle Richard, are you happy?" she asked suddenly. The question surprised him. "Why are you asking?" "Because you smile more now. Before, you seemed sad, even when you weren't crying." Richard realized she was right. He had spent so many years focused on work that he had forgotten what it was like to be genuinely happy. "You know, Isabella, I think I'm learning to be happy." "Me too," she said, smiling. "I like living with you. You take good care of me." That night, Richard stayed awake thinking about Isabella's words. She was right. He was learning to be happy, but he was also learning to be responsible for another person in a way he had never imagined possible. Every decision he made now had to consider Isabella's well-being. He had drastically reduced his working hours, delegating more responsibilities to his team. His secretary, Marcia, commented that he seemed more relaxed, less tense. "You're different, sir," she said. "More human." Richard laughed at the observation. "Maybe I'm learning that there's life beyond work." But the adaptation wasn't complete. Isabella still had moments of deep introspection, when she would spend hours looking out the window without saying anything. Richard learned to respect these moments, staying nearby without pressuring her to talk. He understood that she was still processing the loss of her parents and all the change her life had undergone. One night, while helping her with homework, Isabella asked, Uncle Richard, did you know my mom and dad? The question caught Richard by surprise. No, little one, why are you asking? Sometimes I dream that you're talking to them. They're telling you to take good care of me. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. They don't need to ask me. That, Isabella. I take care of you because you're important to me. More important than work? Much more important than work, Richard replied without hesitation. That night, after Isabella fell asleep, Richard kept thinking about her question about knowing her parents. He had never thought about investigating her family, but now his curiosity was awakened. Who were Isabella's parents? How did they live? What kind of people were they? He decided that the next day he would do some research, not out of morbid curiosity, but to better understand the story of the girl who had become so important in his life. Richard wanted to know Isabella's roots, to be able to help her keep the memory of her parents alive. The next morning, while Isabella was at school, Richard called social worker Fiona and asked for some information about the Sanders family. I would like to know more about her parents, he explained. I think it would be good for Isabella to better understand her own story. Fiona agreed and promised to send a report with the available information. It's important that she maintains the connection with her origins, she said. This will help her build a solid identity. Richard hung up the phone with the feeling that he was doing the right thing. Isabella deserved to know the story of her parents, and he would do whatever was necessary to help her keep that memory alive. After all, Isabella's parents were a fundamental part of who she was, and Richard wanted to honor that memory in the best possible way. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier from the law firm Ferguson and Associates. Richard was having breakfast with Isabella, who was animatedly telling about the play her class was preparing for Children's Day, when Mrs. Carman brought the mail. For you, sir, she said, placing the envelope beside his plate. Richard looked at the law firm's letterhead and frowned. He had no pending business with that law firm. He opened the envelope and found a formal letter, signed by attorney Franklin Ferguson. Dear Mr. Taylor, the letter began. As requested by social worker Fiona Oliver, I am sending the available information about the Sanders family. I must inform you that our firm represented the family in matters related to a bank loan taken out from your company, Taylor Investments, approximately 2 years ago. Richard stopped reading, feeling a strange sensation in his stomach. He looked at Isabella, who continued talking about the school play, unaware of the bomb that was about to explode in his life. Uncle Richard, are you listening to me? She asked, noticing that he had stopped eating. Yes, little one, he replied, forcing a smile. Keep telling me about the play. But Richard couldn't focus on Isabella's words. His eyes automatically returned to the letter, and he continued, reading, Edward Sanders and his wife, Mary Sanders, sought our office in a situation of desperation. They had lost their jobs during the pandemic and were having difficulties paying the loan installments. We tried to negotiate with your company, but the contractual clauses were very rigid, not allowing renegotiation. The words started to blur before Richard's eyes. He vaguely remembered that case. Not the names, but the situation. It had been one of the many contracts that his company had executed during the economic crisis. They were deals that he treated as numbers on a spreadsheet, without faces or stories behind them. Regrettably, the letter continued, after the insurer's refusal to cover the loan and the impossibility of renegotiation, the family's residence was foreclosed and auctioned. The family moved to a rented house in Queens, where they lived until the tragic accident that claimed the couple's lives. Richard felt the world collapse around him. He was responsible, not directly for the absence of Isabella's parents, but for having contributed to the vulnerable situation the family was facing. If he had been more flexible, if he had allowed renegotiation of the contract, perhaps the Sanders family wouldn't have been facing financial difficulties when the accident happened. Uncle Richard, are you okay? Isabella's voice seemed to come from far away. You're pale. Richard quickly folded the letter and put it in his pocket. I'm fine, little one. Just a bit of a headache. Would you like me to give you a massage? She asked, with the typical innocence of children. That would be great, Richard replied, leaning over so she could touch his forehead with her small hands. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Richard cancelled all meetings and stayed home, trying to process the information he had received. When Isabella went to sleep, he locked himself in his office and called attorney Franklin Ferguson. "Mr. Ferguson, this is Richard Taylor. I received your letter today." "Ah, Mr. Taylor," replied the lawyer, "I hope the information is useful. It's a very sad situation. The Sanders family were good, hard-working people. Edward was a mechanic and Mary was an early childhood education teacher. They adored that girl." "Mr. Ferguson, can you give me more details about the loan?" Richard asked, although he already knew he wouldn't like the answers. "Of course, they took out the loan to buy their own home. It was their dream, you know. But when the pandemic hit, Edward lost his job at the garage and Mary had her salary reduced at the private school where she worked. They tried everything to honor the commitment, but they couldn't." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt and the foreclosure of the debt. Oh, it was very quick. The contract clauses didn't allow for flexibility. They lost everything. The house, the furniture, even some personal belongings were seized. It was devastating for the family. After hanging up the phone, Richard sat alone in his office, looking at the city through the window. The lights of New York blinked as always, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in its apartments and houses. He thought of all the contracts he had signed over the years, of all the debt foreclosures he had authorized. How many families had been destroyed by his relentless pursuit of profit? The next morning, Richard woke up with the feeling that he needed to do something. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to better understand the story of the Sanders family. He decided to go to Queens, where they had lived after losing their house. The contrast between his apartment in Murray Hill and the Queens neighborhood was stark. The houses were simple, the streets narrower, but there was life pulsing on every corner. Richard found the address that was in the social worker's report, a small house with a green gate on a busy street. He knocked on the door and was greeted by an elderly lady, Mrs. Appleby, who introduced herself as a neighbor of the Sanders family. "Ah, what a sadness when we learned of the accident," she said, inviting Richard to enter. "They were such good people. Mary always helped the neighborhood children with their school homework, and Edward fixed the boys' bicycles for free." Richard felt his heart tighten. "Did you know the family well?" "Very well. Isabella played with my granddaughter almost every day. What a sweet girl, always smiling. After her parents were gone, she stayed with her Aunt Sophie, but the woman was no good. She drank too much and didn't take proper care of the child." "What happened to the aunt?" Richard asked. "Disappeared from one hour to the next. Left the girl alone and went away. Nobody knows where." Mrs. Appleby shook her head, indignant. Poor Isabella. She was alone in the house for days until the neighbors noticed and called Child Protective Services. Richard felt nauseous. Isabella had gone through much more than he had imagined. "Do you have any photos of the family? Or any mementos?" Mrs. Appleby smiled. "I do. Mary gave me some photos at a block party we had here on the street." "Wait a moment." She returned with a yellowed envelope full of photographs. Richard saw Edward Sanders for the first time, a dark-haired man with a broad smile, embracing a blonde woman with blue eyes, Mary. And there, between them, was Isabella, a few years younger, but with the same shy smile that he had learned to love. "They were very happy," Mrs. Appleby said, pointing to a photo where the family was in a park, having a picnic. "Even after they lost the house, they remained united. Mary always said that, as long as they had each other, they could overcome anything." Richard asked to keep one of the photos, promising to take good care of it. On the way back home, he stopped at a cemetery in Queens and found the graves of Edward and Mary Sanders. They were simple graves with modest headstones, but there were fresh flowers, probably placed by neighbors who still remembered the family. He stayed there for a long time, in silence, trying to find words to address people he never knew, but who had given life to the child who was now the center of his world. "I didn't know you," he finally whispered. "But I'm taking good care of Isabella. She's a wonderful girl and you can be proud of her. I'm sorry about the house, the loan, everything." When he arrived home, Isabella was doing homework with Mrs. Carmen. She ran to hug him, as she did every day. "Uncle Richard, where did you go? I missed you." Richard hugged her more tightly than usual, feeling the weight of the responsibility he carried. "I went to take care of some matters, little one, but now I'm here." That night, after Isabella fell asleep, Richard sat looking at the photo of the Sanders family. He knew he needed to tell Isabella the truth, but he didn't know how. How to explain to an 8-year-old child that the man who was taking care of her had contributed to the tragedy that destroyed her family. Psychologist Dr. Beatrice helped him think of the best way to approach the subject. "Isabella has the right to know the truth," she said, "but it needs to be told in a way that she can process, considering her age and her current emotional state." Richard spent several sleepless nights mentally rehearsing the conversation he knew he needed to have. He didn't want to lie to Isabella, but he also didn't want to hurt her with the raw truth. Finally, he decided that he would be honest, but in a gentle and loving way. On a Sunday afternoon, when they were in Central Park, Richard sat with Isabella on a bench near the lake. She was throwing breadcrumbs to the ducks, laughing when they fought for the food. "Isabella," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I need to tell you something important." She stopped throwing the bread and looked at him attentively. "What is it?" "Uncle Richard, I discovered some things about your parents, about what happened before the accident." Isabella's eyes filled with curiosity. "What kind of things?" Richard took a deep breath. "Your parents had some financial problems. They lost the house where you lived because they couldn't pay a loan." "I remember," Isabella said softly. "Mom cried a lot when we had to leave the house. Dad said everything would be okay, but he was sad too. Isabella, the loan was from my company. I didn't know they were your parents at the time, but it was my company that took your house." Isabella was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Richard held his breath, waiting for her reaction. "Are you saying it was your fault?" she finally asked. "Not exactly fault, but I could have helped and I didn't. I could have been more understanding." Isabella remained silent, looking at the ducks in the lake. Richard felt his heart race, fearing that she would hate him, that she would ask to leave. Finally, she turned to him. "Uncle Richard, are my parents dead because of this?" "No, little one," Richard replied quickly. "The accident had nothing to do with it. It was a tragedy that could have happened to anyone." "Then why are you sad?" Richard was surprised by the question. "Because I feel like I could have prevented your parents from going through hardships." Isabella moved closer to him and rested her head on his shoulder. "Uncle Richard, you didn't know it was us, and even if you did, my parents wouldn't want you to be sad. They always taught me that people make mistakes, but what matters is what they do afterward." Richard felt tears in his eyes. "And what do you think I should do now?" "Keep taking care of me," she answered simply. "My parents would want me to be happy, and I am happy with you." At that moment, Richard understood that Isabella had forgiven him before he even told the whole truth. She had accepted the situation with the simple wisdom that only children possess, and he knew he would do everything in his power to be worthy of that forgiveness and that trust she placed in him. After the revelation in the park, Richard felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Isabella's reaction had been much more mature than he expected, and it made him reflect on the extraordinary strength that girl possessed. She had gone through unimaginable losses, but still managed to forgive and love unconditionally. In the following days, Richard began to observe changes in himself. His perspective on business had completely transformed. During company meetings, he caught himself questioning practices that he used to consider normal. When his team presented reports on debt foreclosures, he saw faces where before he saw only numbers. "Mr. Taylor, are you all right?" asked his partner, Patricia Montgomery, during a board meeting. "You seem worried." Richard looked around the table, seeing the executives who had worked with him for years. "Patricia, have you ever wondered how many families were impacted by our decisions?" "What do you mean?" asked Mark, the financial director. "How many children were left homeless because of our inflexible contracts? How many families were destroyed because we prioritized profit over humanity?" An awkward silence took over the room. Patricia exchanged glances with the other executives before speaking. Richard, you know we've always operated within the law. We can't save all the families in America. But we can try to be more human, Richard replied. We can create more flexible renegotiation policies. We can give opportunities before foreclosing on debts. From that day on, Richard began to implement significant changes in the company. He created a department for relationships with clients in difficulty, hired social workers to evaluate each case individually, and established renegotiation protocols that considered the personal circumstances of each debtor. Not all employees received the changes with enthusiasm. Some of the older executives questioned whether Richard was becoming too sentimental for business, but he didn't care about the criticism. For the first time in his career, he felt proud of the work he was doing. The changes in his professional life also reflected in his personal life. Richard began to spend more time with Isabella, actively participating in her school routine. He attended all parent meetings, watched school presentations, and even volunteered to help organize the school fair. "Uncle Richard," said Isabella one night while he was helping her with math homework, "you're different." "Different how?" "Happier. Before you always seemed to be thinking about distant things. Now you're here with me." Richard smiled, realizing that she was right. "You taught me that there are more important things than work." "What things?" "Love, family, taking care of the people who matter." Isabella smiled and turned her attention back to the numbers on the sheet, but Richard continued to observe her. She had grown a lot in the past few months, not just physically but emotionally. She still had her moments of sadness, especially when she remembered her parents, but she was learning to deal with the loss in a healthy way. Psychologist Dr. Beatrice had confirmed Isabella's progress in her sessions. "She's developing remarkable resilience," she said during a consultation. "The loving and safe environment you've provided is making all the difference." Richard was proud, but also humble. "I feel like I learn more from her than I teach." "That's natural," replied the doctor. "Children have an incredible capacity to teach us about what really matters in life." At work, the company's new policies began to show positive results. Many families that would have lost their homes before managed to renegotiate their debts and keep their homes. The company was still profitable, but now Richard felt that he was contributing to society in a positive way. One case in particular deeply marked him. A family from Jersey City was about to lose their home due to a delinquent loan. The father had become unemployed, and the mother worked as a house cleaner to support 3 young children. In the past, Richard would have foreclosed on the debt without hesitation, but now he personally reviewed the case and offered a renegotiation that allowed the family to keep the house. "Mr. Taylor," said the woman, crying with gratitude during a meeting at the office, "you saved our family. My children won't be homeless." Richard felt an emotion he had never experienced in business, the satisfaction of having genuinely helped someone. "We all go through difficulties," he replied. "The important thing is to help each other." At home, Richard shared this experience with Isabella. "Today I helped a family not lose their house," he said as they had dinner. "Like my parents?" she asked. "Yes, like your parents, except this time I was able to help." Isabella smiled. "My parents would be proud of you." Isabella's words touched Richard deeply. He had found a way to honor the memory of her parents, using his privileged position to help other families who were going through the same difficulties that the Sanders had faced. Over time, Richard began to get more involved with the community. He sponsored renovations at Isabella's school, donated equipment to the hospital where she had been treated, and created a scholarship program for underprivileged children. Isabella always accompanied him in these activities, and Richard saw how she was proud of the work they did together. "Uncle Richard," she said one day, while visiting an orphanage he was helping to renovate, "do you think my parents know you're helping other children?" Richard stopped what he was doing and knelt before her. "I'm sure they know, and I'm sure they're very proud of us both." "Why of us both?" "Because it was you who taught me the importance of helping others. You who showed me that love is more important than money." Isabella hugged him, and Richard felt that he had found his true purpose in life. It wasn't just about making money or building a financial empire. It was about using his resources and influence to make a difference in people's lives, especially children who, like Isabella, needed an opportunity to be happy again. The transformations in his life were also noticed by his friends and colleagues. Richard had become a warmer, more empathetic, more present person. He laughed more, smiled more, and seemed to have found an inner peace that he had never possessed before. "Are you in love?" asked his longtime friend Robert during a dinner. "I've never seen you so happy." "I am," Richard replied, smiling. "I'm in love with life, with the opportunity to be a father, with the chance to make a difference." "Father?" Robert was surprised. "Did you adopt the girl?" "We're still finalizing the papers," Richard explained. "But yes, Isabella is my daughter in all the ways that matter." Robert smiled. "What an incredible change. You were the coldest executive I knew, and now you're talking about fatherhood with your eyes shining." "Fatherhood changes a man," Richard replied, "especially when you realize that there's someone in the world who completely depends on you, who trusts you unconditionally." That night when he got home, Richard found Isabella sleeping on the living room couch with an open book in her lap. She had tried to wait for him to wake up, as she always did when he went out at night. He carefully picked her up and took her to the bedroom, covering her with care. "Good night, my little one," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "Daddy's here." It was the first time he referred to himself as Daddy out loud, and the word sounded perfectly natural. Richard stood, watching Isabella sleep for a few minutes, feeling immense gratitude for having her in his life. He thought about how his life had changed since that cold morning when he found her at the bus stop. At that time, he was a rich but empty man. Now he was truly prosperous because he had something that money couldn't buy, the unconditional love of a daughter. Richard knew there would still be challenges ahead. Isabella's adolescence, the complexities of fatherhood, the responsibilities that came with being a single father. But he was ready to face all of this because he had finally found something worth fighting for: his daughter's happiness and the building of a family based on true love. Before leaving the room, he looked at Isabella once more. She slept peacefully, with a soft smile on her face. Richard knew he had found his greatest treasure and would do everything in his power to protect and nurture this love for the rest of his life. 8 months had passed since Richard found Isabella at the bus stop, and the lives of both had stabilized into a pleasant and loving routine. The adaptation had been smoother than Richard expected, and Isabella flourished in her new environment. She had become one of the best students in the school, made friends easily, and her happy smile had completely returned. But life, as Richard was learning, always holds unexpected surprises. It was on a Tuesday morning that the first surprise arrived. Isabella was at school when the phone rang. It was Fiona, the social worker. "Mr. Taylor, I need to speak with you urgently," she said, with a tone of voice that Richard immediately recognized as bad news. "What happened?" he asked, feeling his heart race. "A relative of Isabella's has appeared, her mother's sister who lives in Miami. She's claiming custody of the girl." Richard felt the world spin around him. "What do you mean? Isabella has no family. You yourselves told me that." "Well, this woman showed up at the courthouse yesterday. Her name is Sophie Sanders, Mary's sister. She says she didn't know about her niece's situation because she was living abroad. She just returned to the US and discovered what happened." Richard sat heavily in the chair. "And what does this mean for me, for Isabella?" "It means we'll have to reassess the situation. Legally, blood relatives have preference in custody. The judge has scheduled a hearing for next week." After hanging up the phone, Richard remained paralyzed for a few minutes. The idea of losing Isabella was simply inconceivable. She had become the center of his world, the reason he woke up every morning with a smile on his face. How could he explain to her that she might have to go live with an aunt she didn't even know? When Isabella arrived from school that afternoon, Richard couldn't disguise his concern. She immediately noticed that something was wrong. "Uncle Richard, you're sad," she said, climbing onto his lap. "What happened?" Richard hugged her tightly, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair. "Isabella, an aunt of yours has appeared," Your mother's sister. She wants you to go live with her." Isabella pulled away to look into his eyes. "I don't know." "Any aunt? Mom never talked about any sister. It seems she lived far away in another country. She only found out what happened now." "I don't want to go," Isabella said firmly. "I want to stay with you. You're my family now." Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. "I want you to stay too, little one, but it might not be our choice." "Why?" "Because she's your blood family. The law says that relatives have the right to take care of each other." Isabella was silent for a moment, processing the information. "But you take care of me better than anyone in the world. You saved me." "I know, my little one. But we'll have to talk to the judge and explain our situation." That night, Richard called his lawyer, Dr. Henry Morris, a specialist in family law. "Henry, I need your help. A relative has appeared claiming custody of Isabella." "This is complicated, Richard," replied the lawyer. "The legal preference is indeed with the blood family, but we have some arguments in our favor. You can prove that you've offered stability, medical care, quality education. Isabella is clearly well adapted. And if she doesn't want to go?" "The child's opinion is considered, especially in cases like this. We'll need psychological reports, testimonials from the school, everything that proves that Isabella's best interest is to remain with you." Richard spent the following days gathering documentation. He spoke with Isabella's teacher, with the psychologist, with the pediatrician. All were unanimous. Isabella had found a loving and safe home with Richard, and removing her from him could be harmful to her emotional development. Dr. Beatrice was particularly forceful in her report. "Isabella has created deep emotional bonds with Richard Taylor," she wrote. "He represented emotional stability at a time of extreme vulnerability. Separating them now would be like imposing a new loss on the child who has already suffered enough trauma." Meanwhile, Richard tried to maintain normality at home. He didn't want Isabella to notice his anxiety, but it was difficult to hide his concern. She, in turn, behaved as if nothing was happening. But Richard noticed that she was more clingy, asking to sleep in his room some nights. "Uncle Richard," she said one night when they were lying in the dark, "do you promise you'll fight for me?" "I promise," Richard replied, kissing the top of her head. "I'll do everything in my power not to lose you." "I'll fight too," Isabella said with determination. "I'll tell the judge that you're my real dad." Richard felt his heart warm. "Real dad?" "Yes, dad isn't just who makes the baby. Dad is who takes care, who stays when you're sick, who helps with homework." On the morning of the hearing, Richard wore his best suit, and Isabella wore a light blue dress that he had bought for the occasion. She held his hand tightly as they walked through the corridors of the courthouse. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Me too," Richard replied. "But we'll tell the truth. We'll tell the judge how happy we are together." In the hearing room, Richard saw Sophie Sanders for the first time. She was a woman of about 40, brunette like Mary must have been, but with a hard expression on her face. She was accompanied by a lawyer and seemed confident. The judge, Dr. Marcus Carter, was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind look. He greeted everyone and explained the procedure. "We are here to decide what is best for Isabella Sanders," he said. "I will hear all the parties involved, including the child herself." Sophie spoke first. "Your Honor, I am Mary's sister, Isabella's mother. I was living in Spain, working as a nurse. I only learned about the tragedy that happened to my sister when I returned to the United States. Isabella is my only family, and I have the right and duty to take care of her." "Mrs. Sanders," asked the judge, "why did you never maintain contact with your sister's family?" Sophie hesitated for a moment. "We had some disagreements in the past, but that doesn't mean I didn't love my sister and my niece." Richard realized there was something the woman wasn't telling. His lawyer must have noticed too, because he asked some questions about her life in Spain, her financial situation, her plans to care for Isabella. "I can offer a simple but dignified life," replied Sophie. "I have an apartment in Miami, a stable job. Isabella would grow up knowing her Southern culture." When it was Richard's turn, he spoke from the heart. "Your Honor, I found Isabella in a situation of total abandonment. She was literally dying from cold and hunger. In the last 8 months, I have offered her not just a home, but unconditional love. She has a structured life, quality education, psychological counseling. Most importantly, she is happy and safe. Mr. Taylor, said the judge, are you aware that you have no blood ties to the child? I am, Your Honor, but I've learned that family isn't just blood. It's love, care, dedication. Isabella is my daughter in all the ways that matter. The most tense moment came when the judge called Isabella to testify. She stood up with courage, but Richard could see that her hands were trembling. The judge was gentle, asking simple questions about her life with Richard. Isabella, are you happy living with Mr. Taylor? Very happy, she replied in a firm voice. He takes care of me better than anyone in the world. And how do you feel about the possibility of going to live with your aunt? Isabella looked at Sophie, then at Richard. I don't know her. She never appeared when my parents were alive. Why did she appear now? The question caught everyone by surprise. Sophie looked visibly uncomfortable. Isabella, the judge continued, if you could choose, where would you like to live? With my dad, she replied without hesitation. Uncle Richard is my real dad. He saved me when I was alone and afraid. He taught me that family is who stays by our side when we need them. He never left me alone. The judge nodded, clearly touched by the child's sincerity. Isabella, is there anything else you'd like to say? Yes, she replied, looking directly at Sophie. Where were you when my parents died? Where were you when I was hungry and cold on the street? Uncle Richard was there. He was always there. Sophie was visibly shaken. Isabella, I didn't know you needed me. But Uncle Richard knew, Isabella replied. He saved me. The judge declared a recess to evaluate the case. During the break, Richard noticed that Sophie seemed disturbed. She was animatedly talking, with her lawyer gesturing a lot. Richard couldn't hear what they were saying, but he noticed that something had changed in her posture. When the hearing resumed, Sophie's lawyer asked to speak. Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement. Sophie stood up, visibly emotional. I need to be honest, she began. My sister Mary and I hadn't spoken for years. We had a nasty fight over money, and I never tried to reconcile. When I learned that she was gone, I felt guilty. She paused, wiping her eyes. I thought that claiming custody of Isabella would be a way to redeem my guilt. But seeing this girl here, seeing how she talks about Mr. Taylor, I realized that she already has a family that I wasn't able to give her when she needed it. Silence took over the room. Richard felt his heart race but tried to keep a neutral expression. Your Honor, continued Sophie, I would like to withdraw my custody request. Isabella has clearly found a loving home, and I don't have the right to take that away from her. The EA judge was surprised. Are you sure of this decision? Absolutely, replied Sophie. But I would like to ask for one thing. If possible, I would like to maintain contact with Isabella, not as a guardian, but as an aunt. I would like to get to know her better and tell stories about her mother. Richard felt a wave of relief, but also compassion for that woman who was clearly struggling with her own demons. Your Honor, he said, if Isabella agrees, I have no objections to occasional visits. Isabella looked at Richard, then at Sophie. Can you tell me about my mum? When she was little. I can, Sophie replied, smiling through tears. Your mother was a girl very much like you, stubborn, intelligent, and with a huge heart. The judge declared that permanent custody would be granted to Richard, with visitation rights for Sophie. He also expressed his admiration for the way the case had been conducted. It's rare to see a situation where all involved put the child's well-being above their own interests, he said. Isabella, you're very lucky to have found a family that loves you so much. Outside the courthouse, Richard hugged Isabella tightly. It's over, little one. We're going to be together forever. I knew it, she said, smiling. I knew you would manage it. Sophie approached them, hesitant. Mr. Taylor, thank you for being the father that I couldn't be as an aunt. Sophie, Richard replied, Isabella can benefit from knowing more about her family. You're welcome in our home whenever you want to visit. Can I call you once in a while? Sophie asked Isabella. You can, Isabella replied, but Uncle Richard is my dad. That's not going to change. I know, Sophie smiled, and I wouldn't want it to change. He's exactly the kind of father your mother would want you to have. That night, Richard and Isabella celebrated with pizza and ice cream. She was euphoric, talking non-stop about how brave she had been at the hearing. Daddy, she said suddenly, using the word they had avoided for so long. Can I call you Daddy now? Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. Of course you can, my daughter, of course you can. Daddy, do you think my real parents, Edward and Mary, are proud of us? I'm sure they are, Richard replied. They're seeing how you've grown strong and brave. And they know you're being very loved. Isabella nestled against him on the couch. Daddy, I love you. I love you too, my little one, more than you can imagine. That night, Richard stayed awake for a long time, watching Isabella sleep. She had faced the possibility of a new separation with a courage that he admired, and she had defended the family they had built together with a determination that made him proud. He thought about how his life had changed since that cold morning when he found her. Not only had he saved Isabella, but she had saved him too. She had taught him about unconditional love, about family, about what really mattered in life. Richard knew there would still be challenges ahead. Isabella would grow up, become a teenager, face the typical dilemmas of the age, but he also knew that they would face everything together, like a true family. Before falling asleep, he whispered a silent promise. Thank you, Edward and Mary, for giving me the honor of taking care of your daughter. I promise I'll be the best father I can be. In the room next door, Isabella slept peacefully with a smile on her face. She had found her home, her family, her place in the world, and Richard had found the purest love he had ever experienced, the love of a father for his daughter. A year after the hearing, Richard and Isabella had settled into a perfect family routine. The adoption had been officially finalized, and Isabella now carried the name Sanders Taylor, a combination that honored both her origins and her new family. The apartment in Murray Hill had completely transformed. The cold white walls now displayed Isabella's colorful drawings, family photographs, and a contagious joy that emanated from every corner. Richard had become a dedicated and present father. He had learned to do elaborate hairstyles for school presentations, to cook the special sauce pasta that Isabella loved, and to tell dramatic bedtime stories that made her eyes shine with curiosity. His company continued to prosper, but now under a completely different philosophy: profit with purpose, growth with social responsibility. Sophie had become a constant and positive presence in their lives. She visited New York once a month, always bringing stories about Mary and Edward that helped Isabella keep the memory of her parents alive. At first, Richard had been concerned about these visits, fearing they would cause sadness in Isabella. But he realized it was the opposite. Getting to know more about her biological parents' history was helping Isabella build a more solid and complete identity. "Daddy," said Isabella on a Sunday afternoon as they organized family photos in an album, "so Aunt Sophie told me that my mom always wanted to be a teacher, like you helped me with my lessons." "Really?" Richard smiled, pasting a photo of Isabella at her third-grade graduation. "What an interesting coincidence." "It's not a coincidence," Isabella replied with the peculiar wisdom that children sometimes demonstrate. "Mom and Dad Edward chose you to take care of me, I'm sure of it." Richard stopped pasting the photos and looked at her. "Why do you think that?" "Because you appeared exactly when I needed you most, and because you saved me, like they would have done." Isabella showed a photo that Sophie had brought, where Edward and Mary were hugging and smiling. "They were good people like you." Richard's heart warmed. They must have been extraordinary people to have a daughter like you. "And you're an extraordinary person for having chosen me as your daughter," Isabella replied, throwing herself into his arms. That same week, Richard received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist from Time magazine who had discovered the story of his company's transformation and wanted to do a story about businessmen who changed their commercial practices for personal reasons. "Mr. Taylor," said the journalist, "we learned that you revolutionized the policies of Taylor Investments after adopting a child. Could we talk about that?" Richard hesitated. He had never spoken publicly about Isabella or about the reasons behind the changes in his company, but after talking with her, he decided that it might be important to share his story, not out of vanity, but to inspire other businessmen to rethink their practices. "Daddy, are you going to be in the magazine?" asked Isabella, excited, when he told her about the interview. "We're going to be in the magazine," Richard corrected. "After all, this is our story." The interview was published 3 months later, with the title, "The Businessman Who Discovered Love." The article told the story of Richard and Isabella, from the meeting at the bus stop to the complete transformation of the company. What impressed Richard most was the end of the article, where the journalist wrote, "Richard Taylor proves that true success is not measured only in financial numbers, but in the ability to transform lives, including our own." His story with Isabella reminds us that sometimes we need to lose everything we think is important to find what really matters. The repercussion of the article was enormous. Richard received hundreds of messages from other businessmen who identified with his story. Many confessed that they had also rethought their priorities after becoming parents or grandparents. Taylor Investments became an example in the financial market, showing that it was possible to be profitable without being predatory. But the most significant impact of the article was personal. Richard began to receive letters from people who had benefited from the company's new policies. Families who managed to keep their homes thanks to the renegotiation programs, small business owners who received loans with more humane conditions, people who found a second chance when other financial institutions had given up on them. "Daddy," said Isabella one night, as they read some of these letters together, "you're helping many families stay together." "We're helping," Richard corrected, "because it was you who taught me the importance of a family." "How did I teach you that?" "You showed me that some things are more important than money, that having a family is worth more than having a giant company, that taking care of those we love is more important than winning all negotiations." Isabella smiled. "You're very smart, Daddy." "Not as smart as my daughter," Richard replied, affectionately messing up her hair. On a Saturday afternoon almost, 2 years after they had met, Richard and Isabella were in the same park where they had had the conversation about the truth about her parents. Isabella was now 10 years old, was taller, more self-confident, but still maintained that special sparkle in her eyes that had won Richard over from the first moment. "Daddy," she said while watching the ducks in the lake, "do you regret having found me?" The question caught Richard by surprise. "Why are you asking that?" "Because your life has changed a lot. You used to work all the time. Now you have to take care of me. You were rich. Now you spend money on me. You were single. Now you have a daughter." Richard knelt before her, holding her small hands. "Isabella, finding you was the best thing that happened in my life. You didn't change my life. You gave me a life. Before you, I existed, but I didn't live. What's the difference? Existing is just breathing, working, sleeping, repeating. Living is having someone to love, having a reason to smile, having something worth protecting." Richard gently touched her face. "You taught me to live, my little one." Isabella smiled, that smile that melted Richard's heart every day. "I also learned to live with you, Daddy. After Mum and Dad Edward were gone, I thought I would never be happy again. But you taught me that we can be happy even after sad things. And you taught me that it's never too late to learn to be a father," Richard replied. That night, while Isabella slept, Richard sat in his office, looking at the city through the window. He thought about how it all began, a cold and calculating man who measured success only in numbers, who saw people as statistics, who had lost the ability to genuinely connect with other human beings. Now, he was the father of an extraordinary girl, the leader of a company that made a difference in people's lives, and had found a purpose that went far beyond profit. Isabella had not only gained a family, she had created a family. He opened the desk drawer and took out the photo he kept there. Edward and Mary Sanders, smiling and hugging, with a small Isabella between them. It was a photo that Sophie had given him, and that he looked at whenever he needed to be reminded of the responsibility he carried. "Thank you," he whispered to the photo. "Thank you for having raised such a special girl. Thank you for giving me the chance to be her father. I promise I'll continue taking good care of her." In the next room, Isabella moved in bed, mumbling something unintelligible. Richard went to check if she was okay and found her smiling in her sleep, as if she were having a good dream. "Good night, my little one," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "Daddy's here." Before leaving the room, Richard stood watching her for a few more moments. She had grown so much since he found her at that bus stop, physically, emotionally, intellectually, but most importantly, she had grown loved, safe, protected. Richard knew that life still held many challenges for them. Isabella would enter adolescence, face the pressures of age, perhaps question her origins and her history, but he also knew that, regardless of what came, they would face it together, because they had built something that no circumstance could destroy. A true family, based on unconditional love. As he returned to his room, Richard stopped in front of the hallway mirror. The man who looked back at him was different from the one who had left home on that cold morning almost 2 years ago. His eyes had a sparkle that didn't exist before, his face had expression lines that came from genuinely smiling, and his posture conveyed a tranquility that money had never been able to provide. He had discovered that being a father wasn't just about taking care of a child. It was growing with her, learning from her, becoming a better person because of her. Isabella hadn't just gained a father, she had created a father. The next morning, Richard woke up to the smell of pancakes and the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. He found Isabella trying to make breakfast with Mrs. Carmen supervising, and laughing at the girl's antics. "Surprise!" shouted Isabella when she saw him. "I made breakfast for you." "How wonderful," Richard said, hugging her. "What special occasion is this?" "No special occasion," Isabella replied, smiling. "I just wanted to do something nice for my daddy." And at that moment, Richard fully understood what Isabella had taught him, that the most special moments in life are not the big events or the great achievements. They are the small gestures of love, the morning smiles, the tight hugs, the certainty that someone genuinely cares about you. "I love you, Isabella," he said, holding her in his arms. "I love you too, Daddy," she replied, "forever." And in that sunny kitchen, surrounded by the smell of pancakes and the sound of laughter, Richard knew he had found what really mattered in life. A family built not by blood, but by love. A family that had chosen each other mutually, and that would choose each other again every day. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard and Isabella's story has touched your hearts as it touched ours. This narrative reminds us that family is not just about blood ties, but about love, dedication, and choices we make every day. To follow more moving stories like this that explore the deepest human bonds, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Leave a like if this story inspired you, and share in the comments your own reflections about family and true love. Every day we bring narratives that celebrate the strength of the human heart and the capacity for transformation through love. Don't miss